special feature.
Pickle.
Did you grow up with the NES, PlayStation, Star Wars, cartoons, and 80s TV? Do you like to think who would win in a fight between Batman and the Master Chief? Comics, games, movies, music, and TV. They're gonna tell you everything you need. Superheroes or not, they got your back. They're gonna save the world of geeks. Comics, games, movies, music, and TV. They're gonna tell you everything you need. Superheroes or not, they got your back. They're gonna save the world of geeks. This Week in Geek. This Week in Geek.
Hey guys, what's going on? You are listening to TWIG's Sunday Funnies. That's right. This is a new issue 0, if you will, of the TWIG podcast. We're kind of trying out something new here out on the network as everybody is in self-isolation. We are enjoying that social distancing we as introverts love oh so very much. But now it's sort of a legal requirement because they'll come after you. And we are doing a comic book podcast, much like our friends over at the GCRN with the Pull Bag. We've decided to start to cover the world of comic books. And we're actually going to be joined by several new people here on the show, though primarily it's going to be a guy you've heard on GCRN over the last little while, but I kind of want to tell you what the show's about before I get into that. So the idea is to talk about the comic books that we're currently reading, what's happening in the news, and maybe we'll talk about issues and other things that happen in and around the comic book industry, such as it is. We may talk about comic book movies. We may talk about a certain series, a certain character, how they've been portrayed in media, maybe other issues in the media, like maybe female superheroes, have they been given proper treatment, or how have things changed over the last, say, 20, 30 years in regards to a certain character. So the topics will be just as varied as they have been on TWIG for many, many, many years. But we haven't had a dedicated comic book show because it's always seemed like such a daunting task. We have the big publishers like DC, Marvel, Image, Boom, IDW, etc., etc. And we're hoping to cover a lot of those here on the show because thanks to people like Blanchard, he's given me access to his Comixology account. So now I have a whole whack of stuff that I never had access to before. And we will obviously share that information with you as we grow this show. But as I did allude to earlier, we are not alone as we tread through these unknown waters of being a brand new comic book publisher, such as it may be, because Free Comic Book Day has been canceled this year. We'll give you this as something a little bit special. I am joined by my cohort in Kitchener,
Alex, who has been, wondering if we should do a show for a while because there's a couple, comic book companies that have been offering, review editions of things, Valiant and a couple others, and we just didn't have a place to put them because it wasn't going to fit with the flow of the rest of our programming. So now we actually have something.
Yeah. And the other new voice will be familiar to some of you, though new to many of you. This is JT from Saskatoon. He's been a fan of TWIG for several years. He constantly sends me odd memes at all hours of the night on Facebook.
You say that like it's a bad thing.
It's always good for a laugh and a look of confusion. So I'm definitely glad. So JT, this is your baby, actually.
Oh, God, I'm not going to crumble under the pressure at all.
So, yeah, I mean, having JT is primarily going to be the host on this thing, and I will be transitioning out of the MC as the months go forward, because the idea of TWIG's Sunday Funnies is we're going to be doing the show primarily once a month at least, and we're going to release it on a Sunday. So kind of like how you get your big newspaper, which for me and Alex might be, say, the Toronto Star. But other big newspapers would always have a back page of just comics or comic strips. And that's kind of where we came up with the origin of this name. We did have a few other names, but nothing quite fit. But then when Alex pitched the idea Sunday Funnies, it just kind of struck a chord as we can cover the entire comic book industry such as it is. And the industry is wide and varied with some really, really fantastic people, some problematic people, and we'll cover everybody in between, try and be as fair as possible, though there will be some dumpster fires we're just straight up going to avoid. And sometimes it's hard to separate the art from the artist, but we're not going to kick any hornet's nests around here because fuck that noise. It's 2020 and I don't want to deal with it. So with all that in mind, welcome to Twig Sunday Funnies with me, JT, and Alex. So one of the first things we're going to do here is to kind of talk about everybody's history with comic books. When did things first start with you? And I will kind of throw things to myself to give these guys time to think and percolate on how they want to tell their own origin stories of how they got their powers and abilities and how they fit in with the rest of the Twig team. So my history with comic books goes all the way back to the 1980s. And I remember the first comic book I got, but it wasn't the first time I started reading comic books in any serious capacity. So I remember one year when I was a child, and probably 1988, 89, probably in and around there, I got an Easter basket, and I was really into He-Man at the time, which was the toy line by Mattel, and I don't think it was doing so hot at the time, but I remember getting a comic book for He-Man. And if you've ever seen the artwork for the He-Man stuff, the artwork that was on the cards was always fantastic. And that always really kind of stuck with me. And the artwork inside the comic book wasn't anything particularly special, but it did stick out in my mind. But my true comic book thing would be I would attend a local show, and I couldn't believe this actually existed in my local area where I grew up, Owen Sound, Ontario, small town of about 20,000 people. They had a Comic-Con, no cosplayers at this time. It was just literally a bunch of people selling comic books, maybe some toys. And I had watched the Fox X-Men cartoon, which I think it started airing in the early 90s. I want to say 92 or something. But I remember the first comic book I really bought was the Jim Lee X-Men #1 that everybody knows the comic art that I'm talking about. When you think of 90s X-Men, you think of this exact cover with Magneto on the cover and Cyclops and Wolverine in his yellow and blue costume, Beast, Gambit, and everybody else on that cover. It folded out, and I think it was used in a Pizza Hut promotion as well. And that's the first comic book I ever bought.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
then,
if you got, sorry, Mike, you go.
No. Oh, no. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you're right. It did have, there was a special edition where the covers folded out, but it's also both infamous and loved for the idea that this was in that era of multiple covers, die cut, bagged and boarded with a trading card on the inside. And they actually, before the complete cover came out, they had 4 different versions that you could, if you opened up the covers and spread them out, you could connect them together to get that large panorama.
Yeah, and that was the first time that I started kind of getting in the comics, and I started talking with my next door neighbor at the time. His name was Breck, and he had a brother named Jason, and he had this big red book. I don't remember what it was called, but it was like the Marvel Encyclopedia or the Marvel Vault. There's a new version by DK Publishing now. But I remember being utterly fascinated by it, and I started collecting Marvel trading cards. And if you are familiar with those, they were the Topps Fleer series. They had one series that was printed on this very shitty cardstock, so it had a very weird finish to them. But then they came out with this signature series about a year later in 92 or 93. And then I started collecting Marvel Overpower, and that's when things started to kind of click with me. I started reading more books. I remember reading Venom #1, which had that red holographic foil cover where he was Venom, Lethal Protector.
Yeah,
and then that one. And then I remember this one specifically. I started reading the Archie comics, not just the Archie Jughead, Betty and Veronica variety, but they had 2 lines for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Sonic the Hedgehog. And the Sonic the Hedgehog license carried on for many, many years, and it wasn't until in the last couple it changed hands finally, that I kept in with comics, and I kept reading comics till probably about 98, where I started reading some of the Dark Horse stuff. I started reading stuff they did with Aliens and Star Wars, because there's the Tales of the Jedi that started adapting some of the expanded universe novels, and they did obviously the movies and whatnot. And it wasn't until probably the mid 2010s I started getting back in the comics again, because a friend of mine owned a comic book store in Orangeville called The Gauntlet, that I started reading more stuff. I started reading the IDW My Little Pony stuff. I started reading older stuff from Transformers. Actually, no, one little piece I completely forgot about. I actually had almost every comic in the Dreamwave run for Transformers, which was, the artwork was utterly fantastic, but the company went under about 10 or 15 issues into their main Transformers run, and some of the artwork was never published, though you can still find scans of it online. They did a series for Micromasters. They did sort of I forget what it was called, but it was like a prequel series to Transformers Generation 1, and it was incredibly well done.
And that was War Within.
War Within, yes. And I didn't like it as much. I liked it more than the IDW stuff, but the IDW stuff eventually grew on me once you got past the first series, which I think it was called Infiltration.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the last 2 years, I got into Boom Studios Power Ranger comics. I started getting interested when I found out there was this character who was an evil version of Tommy Oliver called Lord Draken. And his idea was he would go through time and different realities, kill different Power Rangers, steal their morphers, and steal their like powers, which led to this shattered grid, which was destroying the morphing grid one reality at a time until he alone controlled the morphing grid. And that really kind of got me back into comics, obviously with the big Marvel series of movies starting in 2008 with like Iron Man. I started getting more interested, but Marvel and DC never held my attention for more than a few months. I would read some Spider-Man here and there. Like I read Maximum Carnage. I read some Spider Clone Saga. I actually didn't mind some of the Spider Clone stuff. I like Ben Reilly and Kane. But I was always a big fan of Venom and Carnage. Like you say, Symbiote, I'm probably there like yesterday. I read some of the Punisher stuff, though I didn't really get it as a child. I get it a lot more now. And that's pretty much where I started. I did have a minor interest in some other lines. Like I remember this line specifically. I collected, it was from Image Comics. They had a comic called Gen 13, and they had a spin-off, and it was anime inspired. It was like a 5-issue miniseries, and it was Roxy, Magical Drama Queen. And I picked that series up specifically because of the artwork. I had no idea who this character was, but I loved the artwork so much I got interested in trying something new. And it was just a fantastically fun time to get in the comics. And that's why nowadays, if I see an art cover of a book, I'll read a couple of reviews on it, and then maybe I'll go check it out. So that's another thing I want to do with Twig Sunday Funnies is try new things, not just your typical Marvel and DC, not your Spider-Man and your Batman. I want to try something interesting. Like I know Blanchard goes on about a series called Sex Criminals or Why the Last Man. But he'll also talk about something like Gem as being fantastically written. So that is my origin story, such as it may be. Somebody else pick up the ball and run with it.
I may as well go because I have a shorter one that's not as deep as yours. I, as a kid, only read bits and pieces here and there that you'd find at like the dentist's office or the doctor's. As my family wasn't really into collecting them, and I was the oldest, there might have been some like Casper and Richie Rich comics that my mom had from childhood still at my grandparents' house that I read. So my first exposure is probably through cartoons. I believe, what year was it that the X-Men cartoon came out? Is it 92?
92, 93, somewhere in
Yeah,
there.
Something like that,
So
yeah.
I was like in kindergarten or grade 1 when that came out. So for me, that would have been probably my introduction initially, and then we would occasionally go to like a local comic shop and pick up like a 10-cent comic as a gift, because poor people. But when we moved to Kitchener, the people that were living above us it was like a multi-level house that had been divided up into apartments, and one of the guys living above us worked at a comic book store in town, which turns out was the oldest comic book store in Canada, and actually might be a runner for oldest comic book shop worldwide, like that was still operating. It was started in like the early 70s as like a dedicated comic shop at a time when you didn't have that. It didn't exist. The guy actually had to operate the comic shop as a used bookstore because the city didn't have like a zoning ordinance or anything for tax purposes of what he could, what a comic book shop was. So to maintain the laws for the bylaws, the dude had one shelf of used books and priced everything at like $200 a piece.
Jesus.
so that they would never sell. Like, just, it was like, stuff you'd find at Value Village. And the idea was that was what was required to maintain legal status as a store, as a bookstore, essentially. And then the rest of the floor space was all comics. And it was like comic book paradise. Like, they had thousands upon thousands of back issues for 10 cents, 50 cents. And then when Free Comic Book Day came around, they were one of the places where it was like, oh, you can grab two or three free comics, or you can grab one of every comic if you pay at least $1 worth of comics, which I didn't find out till later on. Actually, in doing that, they were probably losing money because they have to pay for the comics anyway that they give out. They're not provided for free. Well, anyway, long story short, owner ends up dying, and then the place burns down. And it was like, oh, so oldest comic book shop in Canada disappeared. But that was my introduction. And what I would used to pick up would be like, oh, this is Spider-Man, or I'd pick up a comic based on whatever I saw on TV, knowing that there were plenty of issues, but not knowing that how serialized comic books were. In my brain, the comic was probably like a regular TV show, a single episode, or maybe 2, or maybe 5 in a row if it was like X-Men. I had no idea that they'd have a continuing thread for years and decades even. So that was my introduction, in and out of it. Never really was a big collector until I was working a job where I was required to be a tech support, and we weren't supposed to use our phones or anything when we weren't answering a call. But if there was no calls, you were allowed to read anything. So I started picking up the Valiant issues when Valiant came back from the dead. And
for the second time.
Yeah. When they stopped being owned by a video game company that went out of business.
Yeah.
I picked them up when they started coming back because I looked online. I'm like, what's a good starting point? Because it was right around the time of the New 52. So I picked up a couple New 52 comics. I picked up, any comic that was $2.99 because I refused to pay $3.99 for an issue at the time. I was like, I'm not paying that when he already has like 10 pages of ads. And then I thought, okay, well, Valiant, they've been getting all this praise. They're saying the writing is so good, and some of the first things like Harbinger and that. And I went, okay, I'll get these. And then I thought, you know what? Amazon has crazy deals right now. And I ended up getting pre-orders down on all the deluxe hardcover editions they did because they were really high quality. And they were, if you pre-ordered them, they were like 70%, off of MSRP. So you could get like a $65 hardcover that covered 14 issues of a comic for like $28 if you pre-ordered it. So I had I think I still do in storage somewhere here, the first 3 years of all of their comics in like pure hardcover deluxe editions, which are pretty sweet, to the point where I haven't even read them all because there's so much that was coming out and I was working a lot. But it was nice to have them and go through. And it was like, in my mind, I was like, well, this is like, for me, starting from zero, because I'm not going to go back and read 1,000 issues of some Marvel or DC stuff, especially when there had been lots of television and movie properties of them where it's like they would cherry pick the best stories and use them. And at the time, Valiant had no movies. Now we've got Bloodshot, which came out at the most unfortunate week of all time for the movies,
to say the least.
Yeah, literally the last movie released in theaters and shown before the world shut down. So it's interesting to me, like, to go and get the like, not the indie labels or the mini major labels, if you wanted to call it. And then I went and also at the same time started getting some of the Transformers comics. I remember reading a bit of the Dreamwave stuff, which, what was that, early 2000s or something?
Yeah, around
like
2004, 2005.
Okay, so that
actually it was more like 01, 02 is when it first started.
Because that would have been when I was in high school, and I would have picked up an issue here and there, but nothing really dedicated. But that was what sort of piqued my interest coming back into it. And then I started, I would dip in sample, because a lot of times Image Comics or IDW, they would put out a first issue at like 25 cents. And I'm like, okay, I don't care how many ads you put in your comic. For 25 cents, I'll pretty much buy anything to read and try it out. And I tried a few different things here and there. I like some of the licensed stuff. I also had a pretty sizable collection of the Star Trek comics as well. And other than that, like the ones I were basically collecting was anything Valiant, anything Star Trek, and then the odd issue here and there or something. And now I'm at the point where I'm like, okay, I want to look up online. Let's look up some lists of what are the best space, based comics. What are the best this and that? And I'll usually find them that way. I was also a big fan of, was it Dark Horse that put out the anthology comics where you get like 2 or 3 different science fiction?
They had Dark Horse Presents, which ran for many years, and they brought it back a few years ago, although I don't know if they're still putting it out.
That's what I was reading when that came back. I was reading those. I was like, okay, they're a little thicker. You get a few anthologies, and they run ones. I think it was Image or IDW had a similar series that was science fiction, and you get 2 or 3 stories in each. And the idea was with those, I forget the name of it. I'm drawing a blank, but the idea was there were 3 stories in each comic, but they were the same stories. So you basically got 3 comics for the price of 1. They would just tell you smaller snippets of each story. So, what would maybe come across plot-wise in 1 to 2 issues if it was a standalone might take 4 or 5 issues, but you get 3 things. It's like watching a TV show, and instead of getting a 45-minute show, you get 8 to 12-minute episodes.
Which is what they're kind of doing with that QB TV service that's starting pretty soon.
Exactly. So, I mean, like certain things, I think it could be anthologies, especially, are a good jumping off point for people because they can get like maybe stories that might not have sold initially, or they might think are higher risk. So I usually like reading stuff like that, and then I'll wait and see what gets awards. The other one that I read that was the only one I read that was dedicated in buying every single issue, at least until I think some of the writers changed, was when the New 52 came out. I was reading all of Animal Man and Swamp Thing because I really liked them. Because like they were, especially Animal Man, like, and Swamp Thing as well. I'm surprised they were under the regular DC label because they were pretty brutal. Yeah,
I mean they were formerly Vertigo titles, and then they kind of like, I never really read the original Animal Man. There was a run that everyone still raves about, which is the Grant Morrison run, where Animal Man literally falls out of his reality and talks to Grant Morrison. It's like this. Oh God! It's this hugely meta sort of thing.
Oh, and, like the end of, what was it, Spider-Man cartoon where he meets Stan Lee, sort of deal.
Kind of, sort of, yeah, right along those lines.
But yeah, that's basically my history in a nutshell. I'm the guy who knows the comics a little bit. I'm a little bit indie, but I'm not a hipster that I only read certain things. I'm sort of a hodgepodge. I grab something that piques my interest.
Yeah. Oh dear God. I've literally, like, folks, I have literally spent like the last 10 minutes self-editing. It's like, okay, mention that, don't mention that. And just
the real question is, do you have enough comics to swim in like Scrooge McDuck?
Yeah, but I wouldn't be able to handle the paper cuts. Like it could be said about me, JT's got a lot of issues, and not all of them are comic books. Hi-oh. I promise the comedy will get better. But yeah, I will learn. Yeah, or I won't. It's reality. No, I think the first comic that I actually read, like it's appropriate we're calling this Sunday Funnies, because I'm pretty sure the first comic I read was one of those old school, like, long Garfield books. Like, my dad had the first dozen or so of those, and I would read those endlessly over and over again as a kid. I read all the paperback collections of like Andy Capp and The Wizard of Id and BC and all these like paper strip or newspaper comic strips. And where I really got into comics as we know them today is my dad used to play fastball when I was really young in the 80s. And I lived on the farm near two towns. My actual hometown is McNutt, and my other hometown is Calder. And in Calder, they had Calanchi's General Store, where the Barry and Tony Calanchi, these brothers, ran the place. I don't know how they worked this scam, but they would order copious amounts of comics, rip the front half of the covers off, send that back, get something of a credit, I'm told, and then bundle like 20, 25, 30 comics together and just draw on string, sell them for like $3 or $4 a pop. So if my mom was working and before my two younger brothers were born, my dad would park me in the back of the Oldsmobile, make sure the windows were rolled down a little bit, got me one of the old school glass bottle 1 liter Cokes, a box of ketchup chips, and like 2 or 3 sacks, and I was in hog heaven. And that's where I found, Justice League, Avengers, Spider-Man, this weird little comic called Man Tech, which is based on this toy line that I remember horrifying me as a child. And I just always read comics growing up. I didn't really start collecting until I was just about, grade 12, getting out of high school. And that's right around the time of storylines like the Onslaught saga, where Professor Xavier was infected by the evil of Magneto's soul, and he developed this split personality named Onslaught, who's going to remake the world in his own image, and that gave rise to Heroes Reborn. And I just started reading from there. I agree with Mike. I like the idea of the clone conspiracy, the clone saga. Definitely, it ran way longer than it should have, mainly because they were selling so many comics, and this was at a time in comics when Spider-Man had like 5-6 titles coming out a month. So I have to learn to ration my money. And I've never really gotten out of comics. I've always stayed up to date. I just go to the comic store and flip through the stuff on the racks. I mean, getting into the 2000s when the nostalgia boom hit, I actually, to this day, and you may or may not be jealous, Birdman, but I have a complete run of the Dreamwave Transformer comics.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I sold mine off years ago.
Yeah,
but
I
those
still have mine.
The artwork was always fantastic. The storylines were really interesting. The colors and the ink really popped on those pages.
That's what actually interests me probably in getting comics. I think I picked them up during a free comic day, if something like that is when I got back into it. But I have a question. You said you grew up on a farm?
My dad was a grain farmer for many years.
Okay, so not a dairy farmer. So you weren't making like McNutt butter in the city of McNutt, right? That's all I can think of.
Technically, it's classified as a village.
Oh,
it was less than 100 people, but it was a town. I
was just picturing in my brain while you were talking the whole time, you guys sitting at the side of the road selling jars of McNutt butter.
You're smiling way too much right now, Alex. Stop that.
I am. I'm just picturing you reading comic books and selling McNutt butter at the side of the road.
Okay, where was I? Transformers, yes. Optimus Prime, The Matrix, till all are one. I have a complete run of the Dreamwave. I was heartbroken when the company went to shit because Pat Lee apparently is a colossal dick. And I still have that. And that's really where I got in my hardcore collecting. That's when I'm first out in the world on my own. I moved from McNutt to Saskatoon to take part in this broadcast school out here. Sadly, never got a career in that. Ended up working at 7-Eleven for 5 years. And I just was buying more comics than I could actually afford. So every few months I would cull the herd and take all the ones that I'm not reading this anymore. I'm not going to read this again. Take it in for trade at one of the used bookstores or comic shops here in Saskatoon. And I just really stuck to superhero comics for the longest time and a lot of licensed stuff. Like I have a complete run of the Image/Devil's Due run of G.I. Joe comics, which was originally seen as the official continuation of the Marvel title until Hasbro said nuh-uh and the rights went to IDW. So I have a complete run of that. I have a nearly complete run of the Jeff Johns Green Lantern run. Sporadic runs of specific runs of creators of Superman, Batman. I have way more comics to get rid of than I'll actually read again. So the Scrooge McDuck analogy is very appropriate. And so like superheroes, the licensed stuff. And eventually, like I forget who it was, but a good friend of mine challenged me, like, dude, there is more to comics than superheroes. Blasphemy! I'll hear none of your heresy, sir. And then I started to look, and I got into like sci-fi comics, like Resident Alien, which is a series of miniseries from Dark Horse about this gray alien with Spock ears that crash lands on Earth, and well, he's never going to get picked up by his people. So he assumes the identity of this doctor who has passed away that no one knew had passed away. And he's a doctor in a small town. He always ends up in some sort of murder mystery, like Perry Mason style.
That's
which is
being made into a TV show premiering, I believe, this summer.
Yeah, with Alan Tudyk in the role.
Nice.
Although with the apocalypse going on right now, Lord knows if the
I'm pretty sure any summer show was already filmed a long time ago. So as long as they finish the post-production, we'll still see that. It looked interesting, but it is sci-fi, so
yeah,
like it's on sci-fi, so who knows?
Yeah, I used to hear the word people talk about the Sci-Fi Channel. It's like it's sci-fi, but I've since learned to let shit go. But yeah, Resident Alien, and now I look at the cover. I don't try to judge a comic. I'll look at the cover. If the art gets me, I'll flip through it. Hey, this is pretty good. I've since recanted a previous statement I made that the Zenescope comics that Blanchard is a huge fan of is nothing but, cheesecake / comic porn. And to a point, I'm not wrong, but I've read some of those titles and they're actually really interesting and a lot of fun. They're just a heavy emphasis on supernatural creatures. And speaking of supernatural, I have every issue of, and it's a series of miniseries and one-shots of the comic Hack Slash, which is...
I remember reading that when it first came out.
Yeah. I remember that's where I fell in love with the work. Anything that the creator Tim Seeley puts out, whether he's writing or drawing, I'm there. Because I remember Tim Seeley, I first got into him when he was doing the Devil's Due G.I. Joe comic through the run of it ran in 2 volumes, and he did a large chunk of the last part of the first volume. And then he created, Hack Slash, which is what if the final girl went after all the other Freddys and Jasons and Chuckies in the world? In fact, she crossed over with Chucky a couple of times in the course of its publishing run. I really, right now, if I pick up a comic, it's reminds me of something else I've written or something like a TV show or a movie I love. Is like, okay, that looks like that action movie or this sitcom. I'll give it a shot. And 9 times out of 10, I haven't been disappointed. There's a lot of crap comics out there, but I'm happy to report that there is way more good than bad in that world, folks. So I guess one question I would want to ask you guys here, if you currently have or would like to collect, is there any specific titles or runs that you guys would like to pick up someday?
I guess I'll start. I would love to go back and read all the Spawn comics by Todd McFarlane. I've always been a huge fan of the character. I read them for a little while in the 90s and into the 2000s. After issue 100, I kind of got lost, and I couldn't tell you what happens in the comic now. I would also like to get Michael Turner's Fathom. That's a series that I think was criminally underrated. The artwork was absolutely gorgeous. The storyline was really interesting. It was basically, she was female Aquaman, but without being superpowered. She could create weapons out of water, and just an incredible book.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what else I would do. I would also get, as you mentioned, the Devil's Due Transformers G.I. Joe, because I read that and I thought it was fantastic. I think I still have my Storm Shadow Snake Eyes series somewhere.
Yeah. If you do get any one specific miniseries from that, I highly recommend the Declassified series.
I think I might have those.
Well, because there's Dreadnoks Declassified, G.I. Joe Declassified, there's a Scarlet one-shot, and then there is the definitive take on Snake Eyes' origin. I believe it's written by Larry Hama, who's the Stan Lee of G.I. Joe comics. Like, that dude is the shit.
Yeah. I would also like to, it's kind of cliched because it's been played out on TV for like a decade now. I would have liked to have stuck with like The Walking Dead. I read the first 20 or 30 issues of it digitally, and then it got to be a little too much. And it's not just comics to me. It's so hard to keep my attention for very long. That's why I'm glad Power Rangers is only once, maybe twice a month, because Go Power Rangers is ending with issue 32, I think, and then the regular series is going to keep going. So yeah, I mean, those would be the series I'd probably track down. Maybe some of the Superman stuff, because I read Superman Red Sun and really liked it. I like any of the standalone Elseworld stories.
Yeah.
Are typically pretty cool.
One of my all-time favorite comic book annuals, and I would love if I could, and again, with you, if you think of what you want to collect, this is land of the hypothetical. You have make you stupid money in the bank kind of collecting. I would honestly like to go back and get complete runs of Marvel and DC in the early to mid 90s. The annuals used to be a thing. You'd get these over 80, 100-page comics come out once a year, maybe tie into an ongoing storyline. Usually it takes more of an anthology sort of bent. But they used to have themed annuals for like 4 or 5 years straight. And you had stuff like... it wasn't any particular title, but Marvel had this run where they every annual introduced a new character that would then maybe show up once or twice in a comic book and maybe never be heard from again. Or you had DC, which for like 5 years going, they had themed annuals. They had an Elseworlds run. You had Legends of Dead Earth, Pulp DC, where all the stories, it's set within continuity of the modern comics, but they're all written in a very pulp detective noir sort of style. My personal favorite, just because if you know one thing about me, folks, are we allowed to curse a lot, or should we keep it to a minimum?
Yeah, do what you want, just don't be excessive.
Fine.
Okay. Yeah. I love batshit insane comic book ideas, like the Bloodlines annuals of, I think it was like 93, 94, where these giant aliens with bitey tongues who are totally not ripping off the xenomorphs landed on Earth and would bite people in the back of their necks and suck out their spinal fluid. But some people would have their metagene activated by this trauma, which is the DC catch-all term to explain how somebody can fall backwards into toxic waste and come out a superhero. And you had all these like incredibly 90s heroes and villains show up. You had this guy named Gunfire who could grab a plastic toy gun and excite the molecules to the point that they would fire off like bullets of some like concussive force. You had the Hitman, which is actually got a long running title from DC and is a very good run written by Garth Ennis about this guy, a Gotham City hitman who gets telepathy and X-ray vision, who in one issue of the Justice League title only came up to the Watchtower so he could see Wonder Woman naked with his own eyes. He's kind of my hero.
Oh my.
Yeah, and they capped it off with this thing where they're going to meet the Taker, and it's this giant Cthulhu-like entity that the aliens are, puking all this bio juice into to feed because it's like their god. It makes absolutely no sense, but it's so delightfully dumb. It's like watching the Expendables, but not. So, but I'm going to ask you, like you, Alex, like what's a run you would love to?
You know what? It's weird. Like, I'm not interested really at all in collecting any runs from Marvel or DC, or even for that matter, some of the smaller companies that are putting like superhero ones, because a lot of that just gets adapted into TV shows and movies. And, whether or not they're better or worse, I like watching those first. And then I maybe decide from there if I want to go back and read for more details or more nuance. But the ones I'm most interested in, like, I started getting more into reading like manga because anything you could imagine gets turned into a comic book basically in Japan. But I can't think of anything in there off the top of my head, but just that I'm interested in them. But the two that I would like to go back and actually get are a little different. as far as comic books goes, I'd like to read the entire run of Tintin. Is one of them, and then I'd also like to read Bone. You know what I mean? The kids comic. For whatever reason, I always thought it was interesting because I remember seeing them in, was it Scholastic used to sell them when we were in school?
Yeah, the collected trades of,
there's like 2 or 3 of them or something, and they're pretty massive. But and Tintin, because I always liked the cartoon show, and I always thought it would be interesting to see some like stuff that we don't normally see here, like the stuff they make in France.
Yeah. Oh, they've got some great comics coming out of France, and I can only speak on what I've read. But I highly recommend Largo Winch, which actually got turned into a 1-season series on, I think it was on like City TV or Global here in Canada. And it's basically a comic about this guy. He's like the illegitimate son of this gajillionaire who dies under mysterious circumstances and basically inherits LexCorp. And it's all about this kind of like business-minded political intrigue about him like trying to run the company and survive assassins and take over bids from people within the company. And it's comic book, but it's not superheroes, which made me really intent. And I don't know if you guys remember a game on the original Xbox called 13. David Duchovny did the voice, had that weird kind of cell shading.
It actually ran as a syndicated show a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 seasons.
Oh, no shit.
Yeah, just like same production company that did the Transporter TV show that nobody in North America watched.
Except for me. Because I love those movies.
Yes.
But
yeah, it's the same company. Like like you're saying, France seems to have a lot of comics that either go under the radar or get adapted, but people don't know they're from France.
Yeah. I mean, you had that movie Danger Diabolic back in the 60s, which is based on a long-running, I want to say, Italian comic series, but it's popular all over Europe about this guy Diabolic who's like, he's basically an anti-hero gentleman thief who will basically steal anything just for the hay of it. But yeah, it's like I was saying, that 13 one's about this guy. He gets shot, loses his memory, but apparently he's like the most dangerous spy in the world, and he's just trying to figure out who he is and what happened to him and all that.
So basically French Jason Bourne.
I can't believe I never thought of that until this very moment.
The question is, which came first? Probably Jason Bourne's like 02.
Well, you could make the argument the novel happened way before the comic.
I was about to say, there's the books it was based on.
Yeah. I know when I talk about like collecting nowadays, through collecting like safe, what's crossover events used to be referred to wholly as 5th week events, because you had like the 4 weeks of the month and you have this special come out, and I don't know what the exact origin of the phrase is. I just always kind of enjoyed it. I love reading bad crossover comics lately, like mostly the Marvel stuff. The DC, it hasn't always been good, but it isn't necessarily bad. Like Forever Evil came out in the early, I want to say in the second year of the New 52, and it took on Clone Saga proportions of, if you want to read this whole thing and read every issue, you are almost literally buying every DC comic that came out for 3 or 4 months. And you really only needed to read a couple of the tie-in comics and maybe just the Justice League issues in addition to the core miniseries, which was the crime syndicate from Earth 3 comes to, Earth Prime, and they basically wipe out the Justice League and take over the world, and it's evil has won forever kind of thing. Or you have, Avengers versus X-Men, where at the time the X-Men were living on this island off the coast of San Francisco because reasons, which would take entirely too long for me to explain coherently. And the Phoenix Force is coming back to Earth, and they get this whole religious fervor. And Cyclops is, she's gonna make more mutants. And Captain America's like, the Phoenix is going to kill us all, and they fight. Would you guys read that?
I'd check it out.
Yeah, definitely. I think in what you've been explaining, with how convoluted Marvel and DC get, I think that is what can be daunting to a lot of people.
That's what got me out of it, was the fact that I'm not reading a month's worth of comics to catch up on. So I want to be able to keep up to it month to month, not read 10 different books and 10 different crossovers for 1 or 2 pages.
That's why I like jumping in sort of when new companies would get licenses. Like, wasn't it Dynamite that got a lot of the old King Features stuff, like the Phantom and all that a few years
they
ago?
actually had that subline for a couple of years, or for about a year, 2 years.
Was that,
and they also have like Green Hornet. Sorry, you go, Alex.
Yeah, there was like 3 or 4 of them that were from who was it? There was the one where it was the nuclear dude. I forget it. Solar.
Yeah. Well, that was more of a Dark Horse thing.
Was it?
Well, I mean, Solar originally, from what I remember, it started in the 60s as I think it came from the Charlton Comics Company, which is where we get the Question and Blue Beetle in DC Comics. And it started there, and then it was resurrected in the 90s during the original run of Valiant Comics. And then eventually the license lapsed after the second run of Valiant, where it was Acclaim Comics when
it was
Acclaim owned them.
Yeah, it was Dynamite that put it out. They put out a bunch at the same time that were those lapsed licenses from Valiant. Then I was collecting those because I liked the idea of they literally were like, we are not going to include anything from the past. We're a completely different company taking hold of this, and you can grow with us. And we're also not going to do a bazillion crossovers. And the problem that I found is every company is now copying Marvel and DC to do that because they think it's big money in the movies, when in reality, only one movie from outside of them has really come out since this whole crossover thing started happening, and that's Bloodshot. We know that is not going to do well. And you can't count Hellboy because they destroyed that franchise.
Well, I mean, and again, talking about all the convoluted nature. Now, this is just me growing up. I ask a lot of questions. They might be seemingly dumb questions. They might not be intelligent questions, but you got to ask, otherwise you don't learn. And I also love puzzles. So one of my passion projects that I've come on in the last few years is, amongst my physical and digital collection of comics, is I like to figure out exact reading orders and like crossover comics. So, and I know it's something I suggested when we were pitching ideas previous to our recording here. There's definitely one where I have got an almost exact reading order for the IDW Transformer comics. I almost worked out the Fantastic Four going from the Mark Millar into the Jonathan Hickman run through Secret Wars 2015 and onward. I don't know what it is about that. I think it's because, I can go back and I can read these comics that I've previously enjoyed and found stuff I missed before. I also like just kind of putting things in their place, but not in that nitpicky, I must control the world kind of way. And I know what is there anything in particular with your collecting, either now or previous, that you guys had a passion for, like not runs or anything, but what was it about collecting that draws you in?
I'll go first because I just got brief thoughts on it. I was actually thinking about it earlier, and I always went for, if it was possible, to go hardcover, because I come from the era of the VHS, DVD, Blu-ray collector, where I like the idea of all the special features being included. Like, in the deluxe hardcover, not only do you get the 12 regular issues, we'll include the annual, and we'll include an issue that was a special one-off. So you get like 14 issues, and then they'll be like, and here's 20 pages of how we came up with the story and how we drew it. So for me, it was always like I liked having the compendium. I don't like single issues because I feel they're a waste of money. And I honestly, personally think they should go the way of the dodo and completely disappear, because it's already hurting the industry just even having them. If they move forward with only having trades for everything, yes, the comic book shops would have to adapt and change. And if they want to argue, well, it's going to kill our industry, well, then maybe your industry shouldn't exist, because people aren't going to buy $5 issues that are full of ads when they don't have any special features, when you can pay, if you pay half the price of that cover price to get a hardcover when they, bundle them together.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Mike?
For me, it's always about it. Typically with my collecting, it has to be attached to an IP I have some love for, and a lot of my stuff is not unsurprising, like be it Transformers, Ghostbusters, My Little Pony, or in this case, more recently, Power Rangers. I like it because it's more typically self-contained. I can only they'll do annuals and specials. You see some crossover, like I know IDW did crossovers with there was a series called Infestation, where they had basically Transformers and Ghostbusters and zombies. At one point, there's Transformers, Star Trek, stuff like that. I'm willing to check out pretty much anything, but it has to be on an IP that I give a shit about. I'm less inclined to check out mainline superhero things because I don't want 20 years of baggage. Even when the DC universe got rebooted with the New 52, I tried for 3 months and I stopped giving a shit. So yeah, I'm a man of simple taste.
Yeah. I mean, we can definitely an episode in the future, talking about reboots and continuity like that. I would say right now, my biggest thing, like I've been reading comics for years and I highly doubt I'm going to stop, but I definitely stick mostly to superhero stuff. Like I said, there's Resident Alien and, stuff like the Power Rangers comics Birdman's mentioned. What I love right now is you never know what's going to come out next. I dig that about comics. Every month I pick up the previews catalog. Even if I'm not ordering anything that month, I will drop that $5-6 and I will flip through it and just be amazed at all this creativity, all this awesome art. I have to, pull my, we all have that voice in your head, your inner child, your inner asshole, your common sense, which looks and sounds just like your father. And that wild crazy man in the back is just like, you don't need to pay rent this month. You need that $200 Transformer. I've never actually done that, but that doesn't mean the voice isn't there. So I just love looking at what's coming around the bend. And I mean, right now, my biggest thing is seeing what crossover comes. I mean, you've had King Kong on the Planet of the Apes. We've had Planet of the Apes meets Star Trek and Transformers, which, come on, Fortress Tiberius, how do you not want that thing to be a real toy in your hands?
It's true. I'm actually surprised it wasn't a Comic-Con exclusive. Truth be told.
So, I mean, I love comics. I will always love comics. I can read the same issue of Spider-Man over and over again, though not repeatedly in the same day, because that would be weird.
Yes. So I think that's pretty much going to do it for this opening/intro episode to Twig Sunday Funnies. So we will be back next month with a proper issue 1 talking about, well, we're not quite sure yet. We have a lot of topics we can talk about. We can talk about some of the early comic book movies, because it just didn't start with Marvel back in 2008 with like Iron Man. We had Batman in the 80s. We had Superman. We had Judge Dredd and Barbed Wire and Spawn and The Phantom. So we've had tons of movies. There's a lot of things for us to talk about. So we do invite your input into the show. So feedback at ThisWeekInGeek.net. You can also reach us at our Twitter at ThisWeekInGeek. Alex is primarily managing that account. And you can look for us there. JT, if people wanted to get a hold of you, where would they find you?
Well, you can hear me right now with the apocalypse upon us sporadically on the Comic Connoisseurs podcast. I do it with Ben Carver, formerly of Animation Aficionados, and our friend Red Ink, where we talk about everything and anything, even tangentially related to comics. And if you want to get a hold of me on the social medias, it's at JT from Saskatoon on the Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
All right, so fantastic. So for Twig Sunday Funnies, we have been
JT
Alex.
from. Oh,
Okay, we got to figure out an order here.
okay.
So-
1, 2, 3, go.
Okay, I'll go first. Alex.
JT from Saskatoon.
And I've been your interim host, Mike the Birdman Dodson. Live free or die hard. And I'm sure I'll come up with some kind of a clever outro next time.
Well, that's our show.
All right, here's the deal. Every time you watch my show,
I will send you $40.
Checks will not be honored.
You've been listening to This Week in Geek, your source for guaranteed nonsense or your money back. Tune in next week for more info on the most important things you didn't need to know. Check out our website at thisweekingeek.net and subscribe to our podcast through iTunes or any podcatcher. If you'd like to comment on this episode, head over to this episode's post at thisweekingeek.net and leave a comment through Facebook Connect. Follow us on Twitter at thisweekingeek.net and follow our Instagram at twig_official_podcast. Social media not your thing? Send us an email at feedback@thisweekingeek.net. We'll see you next time, and remember,
lower your shields and surrender your listenership.
Just when you think this show is terrible, something wonderful happens.
What?
It ends.
I have to go. Somewhere there is a crime happening.